The cold came without warning that night. Lucy had learned over the years to read the sky the way others read faces. The bruised purple along the horizon meant hours, not minutes, before the frost arrived. But she had been distracted, her hands buried deep in the soil of the eastern garden, pulling the last of the winter carrots before the ground sealed itself shut for the season. By the time she noticed the darkness pressing in from the tree line, the temperature had already dropped enough to turn her breath into thin white ghosts that vanished before she could catch them. She stood, wiped her hands against the rough fabric of her trousers, and looked at the 7 shapes moving at the edge of the forest. 7 wolves. They came home the same way every night, not all at once, never in a neat line, but in a loose, unhurried procession that felt less like animals returning from a hunt, and more like men coming back from somewhere they didn't want to discuss. She had grown so accustomed to the sight that her chest no longer tightened when she saw them. The largest one, black as scorched wood, with eyes the pale color of winter ice, broke from the others and moved toward her first. He always did. "You're late," she said to him, exactly as she would have said it to a person. He stopped a few feet away and regarded her with that particular stillness he had, the kind that felt less like an animal resting and more like a man choosing his words carefully. Lucy gathered the carrots into the basket at her feet and turned back toward the stone cottage. "Supper's cold by now. You have no one to blame but yourselves." She had been 23 years old when she first came to the valley. She was 26 now, and she still didn't entirely understand how it had happened, not the way it must have looked from the outside. A woman living alone on a remote hillside with 7 wolves who slept on her floors and ate from bowls she set out each morning. The village of Ashvale, 2 hours south through the pine corridor, had opinions about it. She knew because the miller's wife had told her directly, without the courtesy of softening the words first. "People say you've gone strange, Lucy. People say the forest has gotten into you." Lucy had thanked her for the bread she'd brought and not gone back to the village for 3 months. The truth was simpler and stranger than any rumor. She had arrived in the valley in the middle of a February storm, her horse dead half a mile behind her, her supplies ruined by the rain, and her plan, such as it had ever been, completely dissolved. She had been running from something she never spoke aloud. The cottage had been empty, its former owner long gone. And she had moved in the way desperate people move into spaces, quietly, and with the full intention of leaving soon. She had never left. The wolves had come in spring, not all at once. First the gray one she'd eventually named Frost, thin and limping, who had sat outside her door for 2 days before she placed a bowl of broth near the step. Then the others, slowly, over the course of weeks, as if word had traveled through the forest that there was a woman here who would not chase them off, who would not set traps, who spoke to them the way she might speak to strangers she half recognized from a dream. The black one had come last. He had stood at the edge of the clearing for a full day before approaching, watching her with those pale eyes as she split wood and hauled water and went about the ordinary business of surviving. She hadn't spoken to him that first day. Something about his stillness had warned her to wait, the way you wait for a storm you can feel but not yet name. The next morning she had put a bowl out for him. He had eaten from it. And then, without invitation or ceremony, he had walked inside the cottage and lain down in front of the fire as if he had always been there. She had named him Sebastian. She didn't know why. The name had arrived in her mind fully formed, the way certain things did when she stopped trying to force them. It was too serious a name for an animal she knew. It sat in her mouth like a stone from a riverbed. Smooth, dense, old. He seemed to like it. The cottage was warm by the time she came inside, the fire she'd banked that morning still breathing low, red heat into the room. She hung her coat on the peg by the door, set the carrots on the table, and looked at the 7 wolves now arranged across the floor with the natural hierarchy they always maintained. Some clustered near the hearth, 2 stretched long beneath the window, and Sebastian positioned closest to the door, between her and the outside world, exactly as he always was. "Frost is limping again," she said, setting a pot over the fire. "I looked at his paw yesterday. There's something in it I can't get to. If it doesn't clear by the end of the week, I'm going to have to try again whether he likes it or not." Frost, from his position by the hearth, lifted his head and looked at her with the expression she'd come to think of as exhausted tolerance. "Don't give me that look," Sebastian's pale eyes tracked her movement across the room. He did this constantly, a slow, comprehensive attention that she had never found frightening, exactly, but that she had also never quite gotten used to. It was the attention of something that was always calculating distance, always measuring angles of approach and exit, always aware of where she was in relation to everything else. She had once told the miller's wife, during one of her more sociable periods, that sometimes she felt the wolves understood her. The miller's wife had said nothing, but her expression had said everything. Lucy didn't try to explain it further. What was there to explain? That when she wept, which she did sometimes alone in the dark, for reasons she had stopped examining closely, the black wolf always moved closer, pressing his warmth against her leg until the worst of it passed, that when a hunter from Ashvale had come up the hill 3 months ago with bad intentions clear in his face, all 7 wolves had been on their feet before she'd even registered the threat, arranged in a formation that had sent the man stumbling backward, down the slope without a word spoken. That she sometimes caught Sebastian watching her with an expression that looked, impossibly, like grief. She stirred the stew and let the quiet of the cottage settle around her. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like distant voices. It was the creak of the gate that woke her near midnight. Lucy sat up in the dark, listening. The wolves were already on their feet. She could hear the shift of their weight across the floorboards, the low, careful sounds of bodies orienting toward the door, no growling. That meant it wasn't a threat, but the silence they held was a different kind of quiet from sleep. Tight, focused, waiting. She rose, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and moved to the window. There were men in the clearing below. Not 1 or 2, a dozen at least, on horseback. Their breath and their horse's breath rising together in the cold air. They carried torches that made the snow beneath them glow amber. They were dressed in dark wool and leather, and they moved with the particular stillness of people who had traveled a very long way and intended to stay. At the front of the group was a man she had never seen before. He sat on a horse blacker than Sebastian's coat, and he was watching the cottage with an expression she couldn't fully read at this distance. Not cold, not hostile, but containing something that made the air in her chest go suddenly thin. She looked down at Sebastian. He was standing directly in front of the door, his pale eyes fixed on the entrance, and every line of his body was altered. Taller, somehow. Tenser. As if something had been reordered inside him by the arrival of those men in the clearing. He turned and looked at her, and in his face, God help her, in his face, she saw something she had never seen there before. Not an animal's uncertainty, something that looked like recognition. And regret. The knock at the door came before she could speak. Lucy did not open the door immediately. She stood with her hand near the latch and listened to the silence that followed the knock, the particular silence of people waiting on the other side of a door who were accustomed to doors being opened for them. It was a specific kind of patience, the kind that came not from humility, but from certainty. Whoever was out there had no doubt she would open it. They were simply waiting for the formality to conclude itself. Sebastian had not moved from his position in front of the door. That alone was enough to hold her still. In 3 years of living with him, she had learned the vocabulary of his body, the way you learn a language spoken without words. Through repetition, through observation, through the slow accumulation of moments that taught you what each posture meant. She knew the loose-shouldered ease of him when he was content. She knew the coiled readiness that meant danger was close. She knew the particular way he held his head when he was listening to something far away that she couldn't hear. What she was seeing now was none of those things. He was standing between her and the door with his weight perfectly distributed, his pale eyes fixed forward, and he looked, she thought, exactly like a man who has just been asked a question he does not yet know how to answer. "Sebastian," she said quietly. He turned his head, looked at her, and then, slowly, stepped aside. She opened the door. The man on the other side was not the one she had seen on horseback. This one was younger, perhaps 30, with a soldier's jaw and the careful posture of someone who had been trained to deliver messages without revealing what he thought of them. He wore a dark cloak with a clasp at the shoulder. Iron, she noted, cast in the shape of a wolf's head. And he held himself with the kind of formal correctness that made her immediately aware of her own bare feet and loose sleeping braid. "Lucy Aldrin?" he said. The The sound of her full name in a stranger's mouth sent a cold thread through her chest. She had not told the Valley her surname. She had told no one in Ashevale, had signed nothing, had given only Lucy when asked. The way you give the minimum required to pass through a place without being remembered. "Who's asking?" she said. "My name is Edric. I serve the High Council of the Northern Territories." He paused, and she had the impression he was choosing his next words with care. "We've been searching for you for some time, Miss Aldrin." Behind her, she felt the wolves shift, a collective adjustment, like a single body breathing in. "You have the wrong person," she said. "I don't believe we do." His eyes moved past her shoulder, to the interior of the cottage, and something crossed his face. Surprise. Quickly controlled. Then something harder to name. He was looking at the wolves, at Sebastian specifically. "I was asked to deliver a message. The Lord in the clearing requests that you come and speak with him." "Requests," she said. "Yes, and if I decline his request?" Edric looked at her steadily. "He said you would ask that. He asked me to tell you that he will wait as long as necessary." She glanced past him toward the clearing. The men on horseback had not moved. The torchlight made their breath glow. The man on the black horse was still watching the cottage with that expression she couldn't fully read, and now, close enough to see him clearly, she felt the thread in her chest tighten into something closer to a knot. He was younger than she had expected. Perhaps 35, perhaps less. It was difficult to say, because his face had the quality of someone who had carried heavy things for a very long time and had learned to carry them without visible effort. Dark hair, darker eyes, a scar along his jaw that caught the torchlight. He was not looking at her with cruelty or command. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for something he was no longer certain was worth waiting for. She pulled her shawl tighter and stepped outside. The snow crunched under her bare feet. She registered the cold the way you register the minor details of a dream. Present, real, but somehow not quite the point. She stopped 10 feet from his horse. He swung down from the saddle before she reached him. Not a dismissal of her, she thought, but a choice, a deliberate act of leveling. He was tall, broader than she'd expected, with the build of someone who had grown into his size slowly and learned to move quietly inside it. He wore no insignia she could see, no markings of rank, just dark wool and leather and that particular quality of stillness that she associated, suddenly, and with a disorienting jolt, with Sebastian. The same quality. Exactly the same. "Lucy Aldrin," he said. His voice was low, careful, and she had the impression it was being held to a register below its natural weight. "You already know my name," she said. "I'd like to know yours." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, not quite its opposite. Sebastian. The word landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward before she could stop them. She stared at him. He held her gaze without flinching, without the defensive stiffness of a man expecting to be disbelieved, and the stillness of him, that terrible, familiar stillness, unfolded something cold and confused in the center of her understanding. "That's not possible," she said. "I know." "I named the wolf." She stopped. Tried again. "I gave that name to an animal that has been sleeping on my floor for 2 years." "Yes." His voice remained level. "I know that too." She turned back toward the cottage. Sebastian, the wolf, was standing in the doorway, watching, pale eyes catching the torchlight. And she looked between them, the man in the clearing and the wolf in the door, and felt the floor of her understanding tilt beneath her like ice beginning to give. "What are you?" she said. She directed it at the man, but she was still looking at the wolf. "That," he said, "is a longer answer than I can give you in the cold at midnight." He paused. "But I owe you the truth of it, all of it. That's why I'm here." She looked at him. His dark eyes held something she recognized. Not the recognition of a stranger, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a secret for so long, they have almost forgotten what it felt like to set it down. "You've been in my house," she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "You have eaten from bowls I set out for you. You have slept in front of my fire for 2 years, and you knew what you were the entire time." He didn't look away. "Yes." "Why?" The wind moved through the pine trees. One of the horses shifted its weight. Edric, standing a respectful distance behind his lord, was looking at the sky with the focused attention of a man pretending he could not hear. "Because you were in danger," Sebastian said, "and I needed to know you were safe before I told you anything." Danger from what? His jaw tightened. Barely, but she saw it. "From the same people who drove you to this valley 3 years ago," he held her gaze. "From whoever made you run, Lucy. I know you ran from something. I need you to tell me what it was, because I believe it is connected to something that threatens everyone in the Northern Territories, including you. Including every person in that village below your hill." The cold had reached her feet now, proper and insistent, needling up through her soles. She looked at the wolf in the doorway, at the man in the clearing, at the 12 riders holding torches in the dark, like a painting of something she didn't yet have a name for. "Come inside," she said finally. She directed it at the man, not the wolf. But she was not entirely sure, she realized, that those were different things. The cottage felt smaller with him in it. Not because he was large, though he was, but because the room had been calibrated for a woman alone and 7 animals, and the addition of one man who carried the weight of something enormous and unspoken reorganized the geometry of the space entirely. He sat where she pointed, at the wooden chair near the table, and folded his hands in front of him, with the careful posture of someone who was accustomed to occupying rooms that belonged to other people. The wolves arranged themselves around the edges of the room. Sebastian, the wolf, sat directly at the man's feet. Lucy looked at this for a long moment. Then she poured 2 cups of the tea she'd left on the hearth and set one in front of him without asking if he wanted it. "Start at the beginning," she said. He looked at the cup, then at her. "The beginning," he said, "is a long time ago." "Then you should start talking." For the first time since he had dismounted in her clearing, something in his expression shifted. Not quite softened, but unlocked, a single mechanism releasing in a very controlled structure. He picked up the cup, held it between his palms the way a cold man holds warmth when he has been without it for longer than he remembers. "My name," he said, "is Sebastian Ravenmore, and I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories." He paused. "And I have been watching over you since the night you arrived in this valley, because you are the only person alive who carries the bloodline that can either save my people or destroy them." Outside, the wind pressed against the walls of the cottage. Inside, the fire crackled. Lucy set down her cup very carefully and said nothing for a long time. The fire burned low while he talked. Lucy did not interrupt him. She had learned in the years of her solitude that silence was the most efficient tool for extracting truth from people, that most human beings, given enough quiet space in the absence of challenge, would eventually fill it with something real. She sat across the table from Sebastian Ravenmore, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and she listened with her hands wrapped around her cup and her face arranged into the careful neutrality she had spent 3 years perfecting. He told her about the shifter bloodlines, ancient families, stretching back further than written record, who carried the ability to move between human and wolf form as naturally as breathing. He told her about the Northern Territories, a vast expanse of land that ran from the coastal cliffs to the mountain passes, governed not by a single throne, but by a council of pack leaders who answered, in theory, to the Alpha King. He told her about the old agreements, the delicate architecture of alliances that had held the territories together for generations, and then he told her about the fractures. 3 years ago, he said, someone began systematically destroying those alliances. Pack leaders who refused to align with a new faction were killed, made to look like accidents, like illness, like the ordinary losses of a hard winter. Families disappeared. Records were altered. His voice remained even throughout, but she noticed the way his hands tightened almost imperceptibly around his cup. The faction calls itself the Iron Claim. They believe the old bloodlines have grown weak. They want to consolidate power under a single authority, not the council, not the traditional structure, one ruler, one law, and they are willing to burn everything that exists to build it. "And what does any of this have to do with me?" Lucy said. He looked at her directly. "Your mother's name was Cecile Aldrin. Before she married your father, her name was Cecile Vane." The name hit her like cold water. She kept her expression still through an act of will she felt in her jaw. "The Vane bloodline," Sebastian continued, "is the oldest of the original pack families, older than mine. It carries what the old records call the binding gift, an ability that, according to those records, allows the bearer to seal or dissolve the agreements between pacts at a fundamental level, not politically, biologically, at the level of the bond itself. He paused. The Iron Claim wants that ability. They have been searching for your mother's descendants for 2 years. My mother is dead, Lucy said. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. I know. She died when you were 7, but the bloodline passes through daughters. His dark eyes held hers. You are the last Vane daughter. The cottage was very quiet. Outside, one of the horses shifted in the snow, and the sound of it reached her like something from a great distance. You said I was in danger, she said. Before I came here, you said the people who drove me to this valley were connected to the Iron Claim. Yes. She thought about the man she had run from 3 years ago, the one who had arrived at her door in the city of Grenfall with documents she hadn't understood and demands she hadn't met, and finally, with people he'd sent in the night to ensure her compliance. She thought about the way she had left. Nothing packed, nothing planned, just her horse and the clothes on her back, and the specific animal terror of someone who understands, suddenly and completely, that staying will cost them everything. She had never told anyone what she was running from. She had not allowed herself to think about it clearly since she arrived in the valley. Who sent those men to Grenfall? She said. A man named Dorian Veth. Something shifted in Sebastian's expression. Controlled, but present. He leads the Iron Claim. He has been operating from within the council structure for years, using positions of legitimate authority to advance illegitimate ends. Most of the council doesn't know what he is. Those who suspect are afraid to say it aloud. And you? I know exactly what he is. His voice had dropped to something quieter and considerably more dangerous. I have known for 18 months. The difficulty is proof. The difficulty is that he has positioned himself carefully enough that moving against him without sufficient evidence would fracture the council beyond repair and give the Iron Claim exactly the chaos they need to move. Lucy stood up and walked to the fire. She needed to be moving, needed the physical act of crossing the room to give her mind something to anchor to while it reorganized itself around everything he had just said. The wolf Sebastian padded after her silently and sat at her feet. She looked down at him, then back at the man at the table. How long have you been coming here? She said. In that form. Since 3 weeks after you arrived. 2.5 years. Yes. You watched me. She heard something enter her voice that she wasn't entirely able to suppress. Not quite anger, not quite betrayal, but a close relative of both, every day. You were in my house. You let me speak to you, care for you, trust you. And you knew the entire time. I knew, he said. He didn't attempt to qualify it or soften it. I made a choice to stay close to you in a form that wouldn't frighten you, that wouldn't require explanations I wasn't yet certain were safe to give. I told myself it was protection. A pause. It was also cowardice. I am aware of that. She stared at him. He met her gaze without flinching, without the defensive stiffening of a man who expected forgiveness. He looked like a man who had already decided he didn't deserve it and had come to tell the truth anyway. It was, she thought, the most disarming thing he could possibly have done. The other wolves, she said. The 6 others. My most trusted men, my inner circle. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Brief, rueful. They were less than enthusiastic about the arrangement. Edric, particularly, felt it was beneath the dignity of the Alpha King to eat from a ceramic bowl. She looked at Frost, by the hearth, at the others arranged around the room. She thought about 3 years of mourning setting out bowls, 3 years of conversations held with what she'd believed were animals. 3 years of feeling, foolishly she now understood, less alone than she had any right to be. I want to speak to Edric, she said. Sebastian, the man, blinked. It was the first time she had seen him caught off guard. Now? Yes. Now, she turned toward the door. I have questions that require answers from someone who has been watching this situation from a less involved position. Edric came inside with the wariness of a man who had been warned to expect the unexpected, and was finding the reality of the situation exceeded his preparations. He was introduced to her, formally, stiffly, with the particular discomfort of a person meeting someone whose domestic space he had occupied without permission for 2.5 years. "You're the gray one," she said. "Frost." He closed his eyes briefly. "Yes, Miss Aldrin. You've been limping for a week. There is a splinter of pine in my left." He stopped, recalibrated. "Yes." "Sit down," she said, "and tell me, from your perspective, why I should believe any of this." Edric sat. He glanced at Sebastian with the expression of a man checking whether he had permission to speak freely, received some signal she didn't catch, and turned back to her. "Because Dorian Veth has already killed 2 women who carried partial vein blood," he said without preamble. "Both deaths were arranged to look natural. We have evidence of this. We also have intercepted correspondence indicating he knows you are in this valley. He has not moved against you yet because he is not certain of your ability. Whether the binding gift is present in full or only partial, he is waiting to confirm before he acts." He paused. "He will confirm within the month. After that, his patience will end." The room was very still. "What does he want from me?" she said. "He wants to use the binding gift to dissolve the existing pact agreements, to unmake the alliances that hold the council structure together. Without those bonds, the pacts fracture. In the chaos that follows, the Iron Claim moves in." Edric's voice was steady and entirely without comfort. "With you cooperative, he can direct the process. Without your cooperation, he would attempt to use the ability by force. There are methods, according to the old texts, involving significant cost to the bearer." Lucy absorbed this. "And what does he want?" She directed this at Edric but gestured toward Sebastian. Edric looked at his king for a moment before answering. "He wants to protect you," he said. "And he wants to use the binding gift to do the opposite of what Veth intends, to strengthen the existing bonds, to seal the alliances so completely that the Iron Claim cannot fracture them." He paused. "But only with your willing participation. That has always been the condition. He would not compel you. He has never intended to compel you." She looked at Sebastian. He was watching her with those dark eyes that held the same quality as the pale wolf's, that comprehensive, patient attention. And she understood, with a clarity that arrived quietly and sat down heavily, that she had been right 3 years ago when she'd thought the Black Wolf looked at her like he was grieving something. He had known, the entire time, what he was eventually going to have to ask her. And he had spent 2.5 years dreading it. "I need to sleep," she said. "I need to think." She looked between the 2 men. "You and your riders can shelter in the barn tonight. In the morning, I will give you my answer." Sebastian stood. He inclined his head. Not the bow of a subordinate, but the acknowledgement of someone who understood that in this cottage, at this moment, she was the one who held the terms. "Thank you," he said quietly. She said nothing. But after they had gone out into the cold, and the door had closed behind them, she looked at the wolf still sitting at her feet, still watching her with those pale eyes, and she felt the knot in her chest loosen, just slightly, around something that was not yet trust, but was at least the shape of a question she was willing to ask. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark with the wool blanket pulled to her chin, and the wolf curled at the foot of her bed. Exactly as he had always slept. Exactly as he had slept for 2 years without her understanding what he was, and she stared at the ceiling and let the thoughts move through her without trying to stop them. Her mother's name had been Cecile. She had died of a fever in the winter of Lucy's 7th year, and the memory of her was made of small, disconnected things, the smell of dried lavender in her hair, the particular sound of her laugh, the way she had always kept a candle burning in the window even when there was no one expected. Her father had never spoken of her family. When Lucy had asked, as children do, about grandparents and cousins and the places her mother had come from, he had redirected with the quiet firmness of a man who had decided that certain doors were better left shut. She understood now why those doors had been shut. She understood, too, with the cold clarity that comes in the hours before dawn, that her father had known what her mother was, what that bloodline carried, and had spent the entirety of Lucy's childhood constructing a life of careful ordinariness around her, to keep that knowledge from finding her. The small town, the limited acquaintances, the gentle discouragement of anything that might draw attention. He had been protecting her. He had died 6 years ago, quietly, in the same small house where he had spent his life. And 2 years after that, the men from Grenfell had come to her door. She turned onto her side. The wolf lifted his head, and looked at her in the dark with those pale eyes that caught the faint ember glow from the dying fire. "You knew all of this," she said softly. "From the beginning." He held her gaze. "Did you know my mother?" Something shifted in his expression. That impossible, infuriating, entirely animal face that she now could not look at without seeing the man beneath it, the careful man with the dark eyes who had sat at her table and told her the truth without asking for anything in return. He lowered his head back to the blanket. She took that as an answer. In the morning, the barn held 12 men who moved with the particular efficiency of people accustomed to sleeping in difficult places and waking without complaint. She found Edric splitting firewood in the yard when she came out, a task he had apparently undertaken without being asked, with the focused energy of a man who needed something to do with his hands. He stopped when he saw her. "You're Splinter," she said, holding up the small knife and the clean cloth she'd brought. "Sit." He looked at her for a moment, with the expression of someone recalculating an entire set of prior assumptions. Then he sat on the fence post and extended his left hand. The splinter was deep and awkward, embedded in the pad of his thumb. In human form, she noted, not a paw at all, which reorganized several of her memories in ways she would need to examine later. She worked with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent 3 years as her own physician and had no patience for flinching. "You've been doing this for years," Edric said. He was looking at her hands, not at his own. "Setting splinters free? Yes. Caring for us." His voice was careful. "You treated Corso's shoulder in November. The brown wolf, the large one. You stayed up half the night with him. I didn't know he was a person," she said flatly. "I thought he was an animal in pain." "He was in pain," Edric said. "That part was real." She removed the splinter in one clean motion. He exhaled, quietly, controlled, and she pressed the cloth against the wound with more gentleness than she strictly intended. "Were any of you ever actually in danger?" she said. "Or was all of it performance?" "No performance," he said. "We maintained wolf form for extended periods specifically because it was safer. If Veth scouts found us here in human form, there would have been questions we couldn't answer. In wolf form, we were simply animals." He paused. But the risks were real. Corso's shoulder was a genuine injury. Frost's previous limp, in the first winter, that was real. The cold was real. Something shifted in his voice. "Everything you gave us was real, Miss Aldrin. We did not perform gratitude." She tied off the cloth and stepped back. "Where is he?" she said. Edric nodded toward the tree line. Sebastian was standing at the edge of the forest, where the pines gave way to open ground, looking out over the valley below. The morning was pale and clear, the kind of winter morning that felt like a held breath. Everything silver and still, the village of Ashvale just visible as a dark cluster of rooftops through the frosted trees. He heard her coming before she reached him. She knew this, not because he turned, but because his posture changed. That slight, involuntary reorientation of a body that has registered the approach of someone specific. She stopped beside him and looked at the valley. "Tell me about the binding gift," she said. "What it actually involves, not politically. What it costs the person who uses it." He was quiet for a moment. The old records describe it as a drawing together. The bearer acts as a conduit. The existing bonds between packs are channeled through them and sealed at a deeper level than agreement or alliance. Permanent. Unbreakable by political means. He paused. The records indicate significant physical cost. Exhaustion. In some accounts, extended incapacitation. In some accounts? In the oldest accounts, the cost was higher. His voice remained even, but those are very old accounts, and the bearers in those cases were attempting to bind far more packs under far more hostile conditions. The situation we face is different. The existing bonds are already present. We are not creating something new. We are reinforcing what already exists. You've been researching this for some time. 2 years. She looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" He turned from the valley and met her gaze. In the clear morning light, he looked less like the careful, controlled figure from the night before, and more like someone standing at the edge of something he was not certain he would survive. "Because I needed to know you first. I needed to understand who you were before I asked this of you." He paused. "And because every time I prepared to tell you, I found I did not want to. I did not want to bring this world to your door. It was already at my door, she said. It had been at my door since Grenfall. I know. His jaw tightened. I know that now better than I did then. She turned back to the valley. The frost on the pine needles was beginning to release in the morning warmth, falling in tiny glittering fragments that caught the light as they dropped. Dorian Veth, she said. Tell me what he looks like. Sebastian described him, the height, the coloring, the particular quality of his public manner, the way he moved in council rooms. Lucy listened carefully. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I know him, she said. Sebastian went very still beside her. Not by that name. He came to Grenfall as a merchant, a man called Harwick. He was the one who brought the documents. He was the one who sent the men in the night. She kept her voice level. He knew my name. He knew my mother's name. He said he had a business proposition involving property that had belonged to her family. She paused. I didn't understand what he was asking. I told him I had nothing that belonged to my mother's family. He stopped smiling, and I understood very quickly that I had given the wrong answer. The silence stretched between them. He's been hunting you for 3 years, Sebastian said quietly. Yes. She glanced at him. How far behind you is he? Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. He was reassessing her, she realized, adjusting some prior estimate of who she was against the evidence of who she was actually showing herself to be. Closer than I would like, he said. We have perhaps 4 days before his scouts locate this position with certainty. Then we don't have time to wait, she said. Lucy. I'm not agreeing because I'm afraid, she said. She turned to face him fully. I want to be clear about that. I am not doing this because you've frightened me into it, or because I have no other choice. I have survived 3 years alone in a valley because I am capable of making decisions under pressure and living with their consequences. She held his gaze. I'm agreeing because what you've described is worth agreeing to, because the people in that village below my hill do not deserve to have their lives unmade by a man like Dorian Veth. And because... She stopped briefly, then continued, because my mother came from something that mattered, and I am tired of running from it. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. The morning light moved between the trees. There's something else, he said. His voice had shifted, lower, careful in a different way than before. Something I need to tell you that is separate from politics and bloodlines and the Iron Claim. He paused. Something I should have told you long before now. She waited. The reason I came to this valley initially was intelligence. Information about your bloodline, your location, the threat you represented to Veth's plans. He kept his eyes on hers. The reason I stayed was not intelligence. A pause. I told myself it was protection. I told myself it was duty. I told you last night that the alternative explanation was cowardice. He exhaled slowly. The true explanation is that I have spent 2.5 years in your company, and I have not once wanted to leave it, and I am aware that this is an uncomfortable thing to say to someone who has just discovered you've been deceiving them, and I am not asking you to do anything with it. I only wanted you to have the truth of it. The frost continued to fall from the pine needles in tiny silent pieces. Lucy looked at the man beside her. The man who was also, somehow, the Black Wolf, who had slept at the foot of her bed and pressed his warmth against her leg in the dark hours and stood between her and every door. And she felt something move in her chest that was not anger and not confusion, and not the careful neutrality she had spent 3 years building. She did not name it yet, but she did not look away from it either. We should go inside, she said. We have 4 days and a great deal to plan. She turned back toward the cottage. After a moment, she heard his footsteps in the snow behind her. The 4 days passed like water moving under ice, visible, purposeful, and faster than it looked from the surface. Sebastian's men transformed the small barn into something between a war room and a council chamber. Maps spread across the hay bales and waited at the corners with stones from the garden wall. Lucy learned their names, their real names, the human ones, and matched each face to a wolf she had known. Corso, the broad-shouldered brown one whose shoulder she had treated through November. Aldrich, the pale gold wolf who had always stationed himself near the eastern window. Bren, the smallest, quickest, who had a habit of knocking things off shelves that she now understood was less clumsiness than impatience. She filed each revelation away with the same careful attention she gave everything, and she did not allow herself to be overwhelmed by the accumulated strangeness of it. There was no time for overwhelm. Edric briefed her on the binding gift, with the focused precision of a man who had spent months preparing to explain something to someone who did not yet know they were the subject of the explanation. The process required proximity. All pack leaders or their bonded representatives needed to be present within a single space. It required the bearer's full and willing intent, and it required, according to the oldest records, a thread of genuine connection between the bearer and at least one of the bonds being sealed. "What does that mean?" she asked. Edric glanced at Sebastian, who was standing near the barn door with his arms folded and his gaze on the map. "It means the gift operates through relationship," Edric said carefully. "It is not a mechanism. It is not a tool that can be pointed at a target. It responds to authentic connection, to bonds the bearer genuinely participates in." He paused. The records indicate that bearers who attempted the sealing without such a connection experienced incomplete results. Lucy looked at Sebastian. He was already looking at her. "You should have led with that," she said. "I was working up to it," Edric said, with the tone of a man who had not been working up to it. On the third night, she found Sebastian alone in the yard. The others had gone to sleep, or to their watch positions, which with this group amounted to the same thing. The sky was clear and enormous, the kind of sky that only appears in winter, when the cold has burned away everything soft and left only the hard, bright architecture of the stars. He was standing exactly where she had first seen him from the window 3 nights ago, and she had the odd sensation of the world folding back on itself, of a beginning and a middle occupying the same physical space. She came to stand beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. "Tell me about before," she said. "Before the valley. Who you were." He was quiet for a moment. A king who was better at the duties of the position than the interior of it. He said, "I was raised to understand the Northern Territories as a system, alliances, hierarchies, obligations. I understood those things very well. I was less practiced at—" He paused. "At the parts that exist outside the system. The human parts." "Yes." Something in his voice shifted. "My father died when I was 22. I had been prepared for the role my entire life and still found, when it arrived, that the preparation had covered everything except the loneliness of it." He glanced at her. "That sounds self-pitying. I don't intend it that way." "It doesn't sound self-pitying," she said. "It sounds accurate." He looked at her. "I know what it is to be prepared for a life that doesn't account for certain things," she said. "My father prepared me very well for survival. He was less thorough on the subject of what to survive toward. The stars were very bright. I used to sit with you in the evenings," he said. "When you read by the fire, I would listen to you talk through whatever you were thinking. You talked aloud when you were alone. I don't know if you knew that." "I knew," she said. "I stopped minding the habit when I concluded there was no one to hear it." "There was always someone hearing it." His voice was quiet. "I heard about your father, about Grenfall, about the things you missed. Bread from a particular bakery, the sound of rain on a tile roof, the smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Small things." He paused. "I heard you say, once, that you had stopped expecting anything to be permanent, that you had made peace with impermanence." "I remember that night," she said. "I wanted very much to tell you that you were wrong." He turned toward her. "I wanted to tell you that some things hold, that not everything dissolves." A pause. "I was not in a position to say it convincingly." She looked at his face, the scar along his jaw, the dark eyes that carried the same quality as the pale wolf's gaze, that comprehensive and patient attention that had been on her. She now understood. For 2.5 years. "You're in a position to say it now," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, with a touch so careful it barely registered as pressure. The touch of someone who had been waiting a very long time to do something small. "Some things hold," he said. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Dorian Veth arrived on the 4th day. He came with 30 riders, which was more than Sebastian had anticipated, and fewer than he had feared. Lucy saw them from the upper window, the column of dark horses moving through the pine corridor, the banner at the front bearing the Iron Wolf's head sigil of the faction he had built. from years of patient hidden violence. She recognized him immediately. He had aged since Grenfall, and the merchant's easy manner had been replaced by something colder and more direct, the face of a man who had stopped performing patience because he had stopped needing to. He rode at the front of his column with the posture of someone who had already decided how this encounter would conclude. He had not anticipated what was waiting in the clearing. Sebastian met him on horseback with 6 of his men flanking him. Human form, fully armed, wearing the Alpha King's sigil openly for the first time since they had arrived in the valley. The transformation of the scene from what Veth had expected was visible in the way the column halted, the way the riders exchanged glances, the way Veth himself recalibrated his expression in the space of 3 seconds into something that was still cold, but was no longer entirely certain. Lucy stood at the cottage door. This had been the plan, and she had agreed to it clearly, and without being argued into it. She would be visible, present, and still. She would not hide. Her presence, the Vane bloodline in plain sight and obviously uncoerced, would communicate something that words and weapons could not. It would tell Veth that his intelligence had failed, that the woman he had spent 3 years hunting as a resource had become something else entirely. It would also serve as the anchor point for what came next. The pack leaders were already present. Sebastian had sent riders in the first night, and they had arrived in the preceding 2 days, slipping into the valley through the forest routes Veth's scouts had not thought to watch. 7 pack leaders, representing the 7 major bloodlines of the Northern Territories, now positioned in the barn and the woods at the clearing's edge. All connected. All ready. Lucy closed her eyes. She had asked Edric the night before what it would feel like. Like finding the threads, he had said, and choosing not to let go. She found them now, not with her hands or her mind exactly, but with something that sat beneath both. Something that had apparently been waiting her entire life for her to stop running long enough to notice it. She felt the bonds between the packs like lines of warmth running outward from the center of her chest. Some strong, some frayed, some barely present, stretched thin by years of Veth's careful erosion. She did not force anything, she simply held them, and then, with the full weight of everything she had chosen, this valley, these people, this man who had eaten from her bowls, and listened to her speak in the firelight, and tucked her hair back with a touch like a question finally asked. She let the gift move through her like a river finding the shape it was always meant to take. The warmth moved outward in a wave she felt rather than saw. The bonds sealed. She heard Veth shout something, a command, a warning, the sound of a man realizing that the mechanism he had spent 3 years dismantling had just been made permanent. She heard the movement of horses, the voices of Sebastian's men, and then a single sharp exchange that ended in a silence more complete than any that had preceded it. She opened her eyes. Her legs were not entirely reliable. She put one hand on the doorframe and breathed, slowly, until the world stopped its gentle tilting. The exhaustion was extraordinary, not painful, but total, as if every reserve she possessed had been redirected toward a single purpose and was now simply absent. Sebastian was crossing the clearing toward her. Veth was surrounded. His riders had not moved against Sebastian's men. The dissolution of the Iron Claim's internal bonds, the severing of Veth's own hold over his followers that had come as an unintended consequence of the sealing, had removed the architecture of loyalty that held his column together. They were 30 men on horses who had just discovered that whatever they had been following was no longer something they recognized. Sebastian reached her. He did not speak immediately. He looked at her face with that comprehensive attention, assessing, cataloging, and then he put both hands on her arms with a steadiness that she leaned into before she made the conscious decision to do so. "Done," she said. "Done," he confirmed. She let her forehead rest against his shoulder for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to feel the warmth of him, the solid reality of him, the end of something, and the beginning of something else, and then she straightened. "What happens to Veth?" she said. "Council judgment. Full evidence presented. Public accounting." His voice was even. "He will not threaten anyone again." She nodded. They did not leave the valley immediately. There were practical reasons. The pack leaders needed to return home with confirmation of the sealing. Veth and his inner circle needed to be transported under guard to the council seat. Edric needed his hand properly bandaged because he had acquired a sword cut during the brief confrontation that he had mentioned to no one until Lucy noticed him favoring it. She treated it at the kitchen table with the same focused efficiency she had always applied to his injuries, and he bore it with the same exhausted tolerance, and neither of them mentioned the surreal quality of the scene. Corso helped her replant the winter garden that had been trampled by horses. Bren repaired the fence post. Aldrich, who turned out to speak 4 languages and hold opinions on architecture, had extensive thoughts about the structural integrity of the cottage roof that she found simultaneously irritating and useful. On the last evening before the main party was to depart, Sebastian found her in the eastern garden as the light went copper and low through the trees. "Come with us," he said. She had known the question was coming. She had been turning it over for days, examining it from every angle, setting it down and picking it up again. "To the capital," she said. "To wherever this goes." He was standing close enough that she could see the careful hope in his expression. Not demanding, not assuming, but present and entirely unguarded. "I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I am asking you not to be alone in this valley, while the world that concerns you goes on without you." She looked at the garden, at the pine trees, at the stone cottage that had been, for 3 years, the whole of her world. She thought about impermanence, about what she had said, alone by the fire, not knowing she was heard. "I would need to bring the wolves," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then the expression on his face shifted into something she had never seen there before. Unguarded and complete. The face of a man who has been given something he had genuinely stopped expecting. "They were coming regardless," he said. They left in the morning. She took what mattered. A few books. Her mother's ring that she had carried in a cloth pouch for 6 years without fully understanding why. The good knife. The wool coat. She closed the cottage door and did not look back at it for a long time. The valley was quiet and cold, and very beautiful in the early light. Sebastian rode beside her. The 6 wolves, Edric, Corso, Aldrich, Bren, and the others, ranged around them in their wolf forms, which she now understood was less a concealment than a preference. A choice made by men who had learned to move through the world in the shape that suited the moment. Dorian Veth stood trial before the full council 3 weeks later. The evidence Sebastian had spent 18 months assembling was presented in its entirety. The iron claim was formally dissolved. Veth was stripped of his positions and exiled beyond the territorial borders, a sentence that Lucy, when asked her thoughts on it, found insufficient, but accepted as the judgment of a system that was trying to hold itself together with the stitches of law rather than the blunt instrument of revenge. The pack bonds held. They held through the winter, and into the spring that followed, through political challenges and succession disputes, and the ordinary grinding difficulties of governing a vast and complicated territory. They held because they had been sealed at a level deeper than politics, because a woman who had spent 3 years learning to survive had chosen, at the critical moment, to stop surviving and start belonging. Lucy found, in the months that followed, that the capital was less foreign than she had feared. The council chambers were full of difficult people with competing interests, which was not so different from managing 7 wolves with their own hierarchies and preferences. She learned the names and motivations of the pack leaders, the way she had learned the vocabulary of the wolves, through attention, patience, and the willingness to sit quietly until the truth of a thing revealed itself. She and Sebastian did not rush toward each other. They had spent 2.5 years in the same rooms, and they understood, without discussing it explicitly, that what existed between them did not require urgency. It required the same thing everything else they had built required: time and honesty, and the willingness to remain present even when presence was uncomfortable. In the spring, he asked her. She said yes before he finished the question, which made him laugh. A real laugh, unguarded and slightly startled, the laugh of a man who had forgotten he was capable of being surprised by something good. Edric, who was standing nearby pretending not to witness any of this, turned to look very carefully at a wall. Years later, when people asked Lucy how it had happened, how a woman who had run to a valley to disappear had ended up at the center of the most significant political moment in the history of the Northern Territories, she never gave a complete answer. She would say that she had opened her door to a wolf who needed feeding. She would say that some things, when you stop running from them, turn out to be exactly what they appeared. Something that wanted to come in from the cold, and be known, and stay. The wolves continued to sleep on the floors of whatever room she occupied. Sebastian, in human form, had long since claimed the chair by the fire as definitively his own. Edric remained professionally skeptical of everything, which she had come to regard as one of the most reliable constants in her life. Corso was impossible to keep out of the kitchen. Bren broke things with the cheerful energy of someone who had never fully committed to the concept of objects having fixed locations. The bonds held. The valley, empty now, kept its silence through the seasons, the pine trees standing patient and unchanged, the small stone cottage with its banked hearth and its bowl still on the step, snow gathering in the garden where the carrots had been. And in the capital, in the rooms that had been calibrated for ceremony and governance and the serious business of power, a woman who had once made peace with impermanence learned slowly and completely that she had been wrong. Some things hold forever.